Hello, everyone. It's Mrs. Wallace. I'm just going to do this quick video about progressive reform that you can watch on Thursday night just to get us a little bit set up to do a group project, kind of an individual slash group project on Friday. So we talked a little bit about Jane Addams and her settlement house, which is called Hull House in Chicago. It's one example of a larger movement called the Settlement House Movement. And it's one example of progressive reform. Like a lot of progressive reforms, we kind of have this, dual thing going on. And we see a little bit of this in the Jane Addams reading that you read in class, like toward the end of the last class period. On one hand, there is a very strong interest in addressing the significant income gap and degree of poverty that exists in urban spaces in the early 1900s. A lot of this is as a result of the Gilded Age and some industrialization and migration, a variety of other things. So she is especially interested in immigrant communities. So a lot of the settlement houses really focus on housing and education for women, perhaps, or for families who are in need of those kinds of services. And to a degree, what Jane Addams is about is addressing what we would today call some sort of, nonprofit, maybe charity program. And this becomes something that she seeks to make it like in a large scale kind of way. And she, of course, also is a progressive and hopes to do some of this work with some government assistance. And the other thing that we see in the reading is, why she wants to do this and some of her interest in perhaps, kind of making the United States, not just as she's seeking to help individuals who are in poverty or struggling, but she's also seeking to create a quote unquote better America. So there's a little bit of a moral argument in that, democracy will be stronger, not only because people in poverty will be helped, but that other people will become, more active citizens. And in particular, she talks about, young people. And she arguably is really starting to focus on young women who are likely becoming college educated, but not necessarily able to have, wide access to the world of careers. So in this like early 1900s time period, we kind of get this match in what energy young women who have a degree of education can bring to a community. And, she's advocating, in a sense, what ultimately becomes the field of social work. But she's also, really spending a great deal of her, reasoning behind this settlement house movement is very much connected to this, kind of societal effect that more people committing to helping others and using their energy and that kind of capacity, makes democracy stronger. So she's kind of got, on one hand, an interest in ending what is a very economic, issue and political issue with an economic gap, but at the same time, she creates like education and housing programs that enable a great deal of young women who become very, kind of crucial to the program. And it also kind of creates a certain type of education and a certain type of program. Settlement houses have often been criticized by others because they become much more, industrial in nature in terms of what the expectations are. So education programs to help women, for example, who are immigrant women become seamstresses. This is not necessarily about pushing, young women or young families in an academic setting, but to kind of set up, some basic skills. And so there's like a little bit of an assumption in a way about what, different groups' roles are, and that has gotten some criticism. And it's something just to kind of be aware of as you consider the progressive movement is this like underarching idea of some type of, moral paternalism. And that's, kind of a sense of this. Okay. The settlement house movement at the same time, really does help a significant number of people. And we start to see this like larger interest, especially in some women's groups of people who had reading clubs or other groups of women. Some, in a lot of cases, become very active in these sorts of activities. So you can see the exterior of Whole House in Chicago. So, one thing to attach to progressivism is this like kind of industrial, professional organization. So we see, licensing for things like physicians, not only that there are requirements to become a physician, but there's going to be organizations that are going to support what standards there will be for training those professions. So there's like a certain expertise, to become a such and such job. And, this is what you have to do and the boxes you have to check in order to become that particular job. So, we start seeing like the medical licensing laws, medical education, so Johns Hopkins and so on. Same thing with bar associations, with the field of law and schools of business administration. The Wharton School at UPenn goes back to the 1880s. And in a lot of ways, it kind of serves as a progressive era function, that there is kind of this expertise that a group of people could have in the area of business administration. And it becomes kind of a significant aspect of this whole kind of focus on expertise, science, and, kind of noting that things can be discipline specifics, things can be studied. A couple of things about women in the progressive era. This becomes a major theme, even though there are many men who are progressives. In a lot of cases, women faced a lot of limitations in terms of access beyond the domestic sphere. There is still in the early 1900s a lot of expectations, known kind of in a border, described as the theory of domesticity. So essentially, there's like spheres of, kind of gender roles. Women's role was primarily in spaces that have to do with motherhood and have to do with marriage, being a wife and being a mother. And in a lot of cases, men benefited from being able to be in an academic space or in a public space or a political space. And so expectations really differed for men and women, especially in terms of careers. Lots of women do start taking up greater access to college and also greater access to professions. Many of these career women in the progressive era gravitate toward nursing, social work, teaching. So there do become certain careers that are like known as nurturing or whatnot, and those careers do become dominated by women. There are a great deal of women in some of the reform causes, and in some cases, women play limited roles because there is this question of how much women could be suited for like leadership roles. But in some reforms, particularly in women's suffrage, maybe in temperance and prohibition, which is seen as like a family issue, there's quite a few issues during the progressive era that kind of fall into the domain of family or women's issues. And so we see women kind of taking on some degree of leadership roles. There is a great deal of distinct kind of ways in which women have experiences during the progressive era. So it's kind of important to note there were different expectations for women who were married. Married women, essentially kind of dedicated some of their individual rights in this time period to their husbands. So that might include, certain things related to their identity or related to their property. Unmarried women generally treated differently depending on whether they were younger or older. Sometimes women's like relationship to work and careers would shift if they became married, and maybe were much more commonplace when women were not married. So marriage like kind of changes up expectations for a woman. You also have a great deal of Christian women. There are lots of church organizations that women joined. It's a space where women become very active. We also see women's unions and a variety of other spaces where women become active, but Christian women start to organize. So temperance, which is anti-alcohol crusades, tend to be not only women organized, but also Christian organized. And there's a variety of reforms that kind of fit into like a moral crusade of sorts. And temperance becomes one of those. This idea of the new woman, we'll talk about this a little bit more in class, but just to introduce it, this new woman is kind of a progressive era, maybe even into the 1920s era woman who is going to, kind of push back against some of the more Victorian, theory of domesticity and woman's work and some of the expectations. New women tended to push dress code. So what women might wear, cutting one's hair, for example, wearing something shorter than a lengthy dress, things like that. New women also tended to want to work rather than not work. And there's a variety of other kind of characteristics of the new woman. And we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. But we do start to see kind of these new identities. We also have very specific challenges for women of color. Just like we've been talking about in broader places in class, racial discrimination, discrimination against people because they're female, and also a person of color, very, very commonplace. So in some cases, women in the South who were women of color might have been still part of a Jim Crow segregation system, might still face sexual assault by white men. So you also had job opportunities that even exist for women who might be in the South or the North, who might be, women of color who potentially are working as domestics, for example, jobs that may have been gender appropriate professions that were available for white women weren't always available for women of color. And we also see a lot of segregation in a lot of the movements, even the movements that are designed to address women's issues like women's suffrage. There's an incredible amount of segregation. And so we see like organized women's groups that are white women and organized women's group that are women of color. And some of that is like very notable because these various, organizations are, headed in similar directions, but also people are having very different experiences. And lastly, we can also note LGBTQ plus women, very, very significant. A lot of historians today recognize a great deal of the numbers of women who were, involved with other women in a lot of cases, or gender non-conforming women who were leaders in the national suffrage movement. Sometimes even during the movement, this was underplayed a little bit. There's a reference in one of the readings that you had for Wednesday, I think. You were reading a woman by the name of Blackwell. She is a woman who is the daughter of a famous suffragette named Lucy Stone. And Alice Stone Blackwell becomes a famous suffragette and, feminist in a sense in her own right. And she writes about women's rights. But one stance she really doesn't take is, the stance of free love. So she kind of diminishes that. And she's really talking here about same-sex couples. She's diminishing that because she sees it perhaps as something that could be, detrimental to the larger movement. So, kind of note in a sense that there's a lot of kind of issues that we would attach to modern day, culture wars and, political dynamics. A lot of the topics that we're talking about, in 2026 are definitely, very much in play. There was a very common reference known as a Boston marriage to describe two women who lived together but were not, necessarily seen as a romantic couple, but there was quite a bit of, code in that kind of relationship. So lots and lots of historians have uncovered a lot of, love stories between suffrage leaders, for example, who ultimately, this became a very significant part of their identity, and the same with gender non-conforming women. So, it's kind of an interesting piece that has been getting a lot of attention more recently, and, kind of refocus